What happens when silence stops being a sign of weakness and becomes a weapon? Most people never notice it, but every connection you enter follows an invisible rhythm. One side sets the pace, the other adjusts. One observes, the other reacts. And the moment you start reacting, you stop leading. We live in an age of noise, endless messages, constant notifications, emotional urgency disguised as importance. Everyone is trying to be seen, to be chosen, to feel like they matter. But in this chaos, power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who can hold still, the one who doesn't rush to explain, doesn't chase clarity, doesn't fill every gap with words, because silence doesn't disappear. It presses. Silence interrupts patterns people rely on. And when the pattern breaks, most panic. They send the follow-up text. They soften their stance. They accept less, just to keep something alive. But here's the truth most men feel in their body before they can explain it in words. What hurts isn't being rejected. It's being kept close enough to hope, and far enough to never feel chosen. This video will show you why that dynamic is so dangerous. Why crumbs hurt more than rejection. How inconsistent attention rewires your nervous system. And why the moment you stop reacting, the balance of power begins to shift. Quietly, irreversibly. Before we go deeper, anchor yourself for a moment. If you are or have been surviving on crumbs, waiting for messages that came too late, like this video, comment "No more crumbs." So I know you're not just watching, you're choosing differently. And if this resonates, subscribe to Stoic Silence and start this journey now, where silence becomes strength and strength becomes identity. Because what you're about to realize changes everything. You weren't denied, you were kept. And once you see that, you'll never tolerate crumbs the same way again. Let's begin. 1. Crumbs hurt more than rejection. Being rejected hurts. It's sharp, direct, and painful, but it's honest. Being fed crumbs does something far worse. It quietly rewires your nervous system. You weren't denied, you were kept barely. Just enough attention to stay hopeful, never enough to feel chosen. That's what makes crumbs so dangerous. Rejection closes a door. Crumbs leave it half open, just wide enough for your mind to keep walking back in. You tell yourself you're being patient, understanding, mature. But what you're really doing is negotiating with uncertainty, a late reply that arrives just when you're about to detach. A vague promise that sounds meaningful but never turns into action. A half-hearted message that disappears the moment you lean in with real intention, and each time you repeat the same sentence to yourself. At least they didn't leave. That sentence feels comforting, but it's the sentence that keeps you trapped. Because while your mind tries to rationalize the situation, your body already knows the truth. You feel it in the tension that never fully leaves your chest. The anxiety that spikes when your phone lights up and sinks when it doesn't. The constant anticipation without relief, without resolution. Crumbs don't satisfy. They condition. They train your nervous system to stay alert, to wait, to scan for signs. They teach you that peace is temporary and connection must be earned through endurance. Over time, that hunger doesn't make you stronger. It erodes your self-respect. This is where Stoicism brings clarity most people avoid. What destabilizes you is not loss. Loss is clean. Loss ends the story. What destabilizes you is uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps you suspended. It keeps you hoping instead of deciding. It keeps you reacting instead of choosing. And the longer you live there, the smaller your world becomes. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men don't want to see. The person who gave you crumbs wasn't confused. They weren't overwhelmed. They weren't unsure of their feelings. They were watching. They were watching how little they could give and still keep you engaged. How long you'd stay without clarity. How much of yourself you'd hand over just to avoid the discomfort of absence. That's why crumbs hurt more than rejection. Rejection respects your dignity enough to be final. Crumbs invite you to abandon it slowly. And the real danger isn't that they didn't choose you. It's that you started choosing less for yourself. Once you see this clearly, the story changes. You stop asking why they couldn't give more. You start asking why you accepted so little. That question is painful, but it's also the beginning of strength. Because the moment you stop surviving on crumbs, the dynamic no longer works. The leverage disappears, the balance shifts, and that's exactly where the psychology turns dangerous for them. 2. Crumbs create addiction, not love. What you mistook for connection was actually intermittent reinforcement. That realization changes everything because it forces you to see the situation not through emotion, but through mechanics. Your desire didn't grow because they were rare or extraordinary. It didn't deepen because of compatibility or shared depth. It grew because they were inconsistent. That inconsistency is what hooked you. If the attention had stopped completely, the pain would have been sharp but short. If it had been consistent, your nervous system could have relaxed. Instead, you were kept in between, close enough to hope, far enough to stay unsettled. Just like a slot machine, sometimes it pays out, and that sometimes is what keeps you pulling the lever. One message arrives after silence. One moment of warmth follows distance. One sign of interest appears right when you're about to let go. Your mind learns to associate waiting with relief. Your body learns that anticipation might be rewarded eventually. And without realizing it, your dopamine system stops resting and starts chasing. This is the conflict most men never recognize while they're inside it. Dopamine isn't the chemical of happiness. It's the chemical of pursuit. It doesn't calm you. It activates you. It keeps you alert, scanning, checking, hoping. Every unpredictable reward trains your brain to wait, to reread messages, to check your phone, to replay conversations and search for meaning. That's not romance, that's neurological conditioning. Over time, this pattern doesn't create intimacy. It creates fixation. Your thoughts return to them when you least expect it. Silence feels heavier than it should. A small gesture carries disproportionate emotional weight, and you start to believe the intensity means something. But intensity born from uncertainty isn't depth, it's dependence. When attention is scarce and random, the mind becomes obsessive. Not because the other person is extraordinary, but because the nervous system is trying to resolve an open loop. It wants closure. It wants relief. It wants the tension to stop. This is why so many men blame themselves afterward. They call themselves weak, naive, too emotional, but that judgment misses the point. You weren't weak. You were neurologically trapped. Your brain responded exactly the way it's wired to respond to intermittent reward. This isn't a character flaw. It's a human response to unpredictability. Stoicism doesn't deny biology. It works with it. It teaches you to recognize when your reactions are being shaped by external patterns instead of internal principles. Once you see that your attachment was fueled by inconsistency, something breaks. You stop romanticizing the crumbs. You stop mistaking stimulation for connection. You stop chasing the next hit of reassurance. And that clarity shifts the dynamic. Because obsession only flows one way until the pattern breaks. As long as the rewards remain unpredictable, the person receiving them stays hooked. But the moment the reinforcement disappears, when attention becomes consistently absent instead of sporadic, the conditioning reverses. The nervous system that once chased now feels the loss. The mind that once waited now wonders. The person who controlled the rhythm now feels the void. And that's when the pressure quietly moves to the other side. Not because you demanded anything, not because you explained yourself, but because you stopped feeding the cycle that kept you trapped. And once that happens, Obsession no longer belongs to the one who waited. It migrates, which leads directly into the next truth most men never expect. Why giving more never saved the connection, and why it slowly destroyed desire instead. 3. Why giving more kills desire. The moment you tried harder, attraction started dying, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. The way a fire fades when it's smothered instead of fed. You believed effort would restore balance. That if you showed more patience, more understanding, more commitment, things would stabilize. That love was a matter of proving consistency until the other person finally felt safe enough to choose you. It never works that way. What you didn't realize at the time is that effort doesn't create equilibrium when desire is already uneven. It exposes the imbalance. They pull back, you lean in. They go quiet, you explain. They hesitate, you reassure. Every time uncertainty appeared, you filled the gap with words, presence, availability. On the surface, it looked mature, responsible, loving. But underneath, something critical was happening. Every gap you filled removed tension. And tension is not a flaw in attraction. It's the source of it. Desire needs space to breathe. It needs uncertainty to spark curiosity. It needs the possibility of loss to create value. When nothing is at risk, nothing is valued. By rushing to close every emotional distance, you eliminated the very conditions that allow desire to grow. You made yourself safe, but safety without polarity turns into predictability, and predictability slowly drains attraction. This is where many men confuse effort with strength. Stoic philosophy draws a sharp line here. Power is not shown through overextension, it's shown through restraint. Restraint doesn't mean indifference, it means self-command. It means you don't abandon your center just to keep someone close. It means you don't trade mystery for reassurance. It means you don't give more simply because the other person gives less. But when you were inside the dynamic, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like responsibility. You told yourself you were being the bigger person. That relationships require compromise. That someone has to hold things together. And slowly, without noticing, you became the only one holding anything at all. Each explanation made you easier to read. Each reassurance made you easier to predict. Each extra message taught them that distance would always be met with effort, not consequence. That's the part no one warns you about. Attraction doesn't die because you cared. It dies because caring turned into compensation. Instead of letting silence create reflection, you replaced it with clarity. Instead of letting absence generate curiosity, you replaced it with presence. Instead of letting uncertainty do its work, you removed it completely. And with it, you erased mystery. Mystery isn't about playing games. It's about having depth that isn't immediately accessible. It's about not revealing everything just to soothe someone else's discomfort. When someone knows exactly how you'll respond, when, how, and with what emotional tone, they no longer feel tension. They feel certainty, and certainty without investment doesn't inspire desire. It breeds complacency. This is why giving more never fixes a one-sided dynamic. It doesn't raise attraction, it lowers perceived value, because value is always tied to selectivity. Stoicism doesn't teach withdrawal as punishment, it teaches restraint as alignment. When you stop overgiving, you don't become cold. You become grounded. You don't prove love through sacrifice. You express self-respect through boundaries. And here's the truth most men only understand after the fact. By giving more, you didn't prove love. You erased mystery. You taught them that access to you had no cost, that your presence was guaranteed, that your energy would always be available, regardless of how little they invested. And mystery is where power lives. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The power to let silence speak. The power to let space reveal truth. The power to stop chasing connection and start embodying value. Because once you stop filling every gap, something remarkable happens. The space you leave behind begins to work on them. And that space, not effort, is what shifts the dynamic. Which leads to the next realization most people never see until it's too late. They were never testing your love. They were testing your limits. 4. They were never testing your love. They were testing your limits. This wasn't about feelings. It was a silent measurement. While you were trying to understand their emotions, their hesitation, their mixed signals, something else was happening underneath. You thought they were unsure. You thought they didn't know what they wanted. You assumed time and patience would eventually bring clarity. But they weren't confused. They were assessing. They were watching how fast you replied when they pulled away. They were noticing how much distance you tolerated without pushing back. They were paying attention to how easily you stayed, even when effort disappeared. None of this required cruelty. It didn't even require intention. Human beings naturally learn where boundaries are by leaning on them. And when nothing pushes back, pressure increases. Every reaction you gave became data. Your quick replies showed urgency. Your explanations showed discomfort with silence. Your willingness to stay showed how much you were willing to sacrifice just to keep the connection alive. Over time, a pattern formed, and that pattern taught them something dangerous. Access to you was guaranteed. This is where many men misunderstand their own role. You believed consistency would build trust. You believed patience would inspire appreciation. You believed staying calm and available was strength. But consistency without boundaries doesn't create respect. It creates control. Your reliability became predictable. Your availability became expected. And slowly, without any confrontation, your consistency turned into their leverage. Stoicism cuts through this illusion with a simple rule. Whoever controls reactions controls the dynamic. If their silence dictates your mood, they lead. If their distance triggers your effort, they lead. If their uncertainty forces your reassurance, they lead. Not because they are stronger, but because you are reacting. Reaction places you downstream. It hands the steering wheel to someone else. And the longer you stay there, the more you lose touch with yourself. This is the truth most men don't want to face. You didn't lose them by pulling away. You lost yourself by staying too available. Every time you ignored your discomfort to avoid tension, you moved further from your center. Every time you accepted less than you deserved just to keep things going, you taught them how to treat you. And here's the quiet cost of that lesson. When you give people unlimited access without consequence, they stop valuing the access. Not because they're bad, but because certainty removes urgency. Stoicism doesn't ask you to punish or manipulate. It asks you to reclaim self-command, to stop letting someone else's behavior dictate your internal state, to choose when to engage instead of reacting on instinct. The moment you stop reacting, the measurements stop working. They can no longer read you the same way. They can no longer predict your moves. They can no longer rely on your availability. And that's when the dynamic begins to shift. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through stillness. When reaction disappears, control dissolves. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Clarity, balance, and self-respect. They were testing your limits, and the test only ends when you stop reacting. 5. Silence is the moment the dynamic flips. Silence doesn't chase, it destabilizes. That's the part most men don't understand at first, because silence feels dangerous when you've already invested emotionally. When distance appears, the instinct isn't strength, it's fear. Fear that silence means loss. Fear that if you don't act quickly, everything will slip away. So you do what feels natural. You text, you explain, you reassure, you restore the old rhythm. On the surface, it looks like maturity, like communication, like effort, but beneath it, something critical is happening. Every time you rush to fill the silence, you confirm that the old dynamic still works. You teach them that distance will always be met with pursuit, that uncertainty will always be met with clarity, that silence will always be softened by your presence. And that's where the power stays exactly where it was. Silence, when held, interrupts expectation. Human beings don't just get attached to people, they get attached to patterns, response times, emotional rhythms, predictable reassurance. When someone knows exactly how you'll react to withdrawal, they feel safe pulling away. There's no cost, no risk, no consequence. But silence breaks that loop. In a world addicted to response, silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a threat, not because it's aggressive, but because it removes certainty. It creates a gap where the mind can no longer rely on habit. The expected reply doesn't come. The familiar reassurance is missing. The rhythm they've grown comfortable with suddenly skips a beat. That gap is where the dynamic flips. Most men panic in that gap. They interpret it as rejection in progress. They mistake discomfort for failure. And because the discomfort is real, tight chest, racing thoughts, urge to fix, they rush back in to make it stop. But that discomfort isn't a sign you're losing ground. It's a sign the old pattern is breaking. Stoicism teaches that power isn't found in immediate action. It's found in self-command. When you stop reacting automatically, you step out of predictability. And the moment you become unpredictable, the emotional balance begins to shift. Unpredictability doesn't mean cruelty. It doesn't mean manipulation. It means your behavior is no longer controlled by their movements. When you stop reacting, you stop being managed. They no longer know how long you'll wait, what silence means, whether you'll step forward or step away. And that uncertainty does something powerful. It turns their attention inward. Instead of monitoring your responses, they start monitoring themselves. They replay interactions. They question assumptions. They wonder what changed. That's why silence is magnetic. Not because it begs to be noticed, but because it removes the familiar signals they relied on. It disrupts the emotional autopilot. It forces awareness. And this is the moment crumbs stop working. Crumbs only have power when you're waiting for them. When silence replaces anticipation, the small gestures lose their effect. A vague message no longer satisfies. A half-hearted reach-out no longer calms the tension. Because you're no longer trained to respond on cue. That's when the dynamic truly flips. You're no longer chasing reassurance. You're no longer restoring balance for them. You're no longer smoothing over the discomfort they created. You're holding still. And stillness, when chosen deliberately, carries weight. This is where many men confuse silence with absence. They fear disappearing. But silence isn't disappearance. It's presence without reaction. It's staying grounded instead of scrambling. It's allowing space to exist without rushing to fill it. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. The person who once controlled the rhythm now feels off balance. The person who once gave crumbs now feels the lack. The person who once assumed your availability now questions it. Not because you demanded anything, not because you confronted them, but because you stopped doing the one thing that kept the old dynamic alive, reacting. Silence doesn't chase. It destabilizes. And once destabilization begins, the next phase is inevitable. Because what was once comfortable starts to feel uncertain. That's when crumbs lose their power completely. 6. The psychological collapse begins quietly. Obsession never starts loud. It doesn't arrive with dramatic confessions or sudden emotional outbursts. It begins with something far more subtle, discomfort. That discomfort appears the moment access disappears. They were never attached to silence. They were attached to availability, to knowing you would respond, to knowing you were there, to knowing that no matter how distant they became, the line to you was still open. And when that access is removed, the system doesn't panic immediately. At first, it barely registers. Day 1 feels neutral. Nothing happens. They assume it's temporary. A mood, a pause. By day 3, curiosity slips in quietly. Not longing, not regret, just a subtle awareness that something familiar is missing. By day 7, unease sets in. This is where the conflict begins, because the human mind cannot tolerate open loops. It needs resolution. It needs explanation. When neither arrives, the mind starts working against itself. They replay conversations. They reread messages. They check timestamps they once ignored. Not because they suddenly care more, but because certainty has vanished. And certainty was their real comfort. When you were always there, they didn't have to wonder. They didn't have to reflect. They didn't have to confront how little they gave. Your presence made everything easy. Your reactions closed every loop. Now the loops stay open. And open loops are unbearable to a mind accustomed to control. So the stories begin. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you're upset. Maybe there's someone else. None of these stories bring relief. They only deepen the tension. Because without confirmation, imagination fills the space, and imagination is rarely gentle. This is where the psychological pressure quietly starts to build. They don't announce it. They don't show it publicly. Often they don't even admit it to themselves. But something shifts internally. Your absence forces them to feel what you once felt. The waiting, the uncertainty, the unanswered questions. The emotional imbalance you carried alone is now mirrored back to them. Not because you demanded attention, not because you confronted or explained, but because you removed certainty. That's the part many men misunderstand. They believe power comes from making the other person miss them intentionally, from triggering emotion on purpose, from forcing reaction. But what actually destabilizes people is not emotional attack, it's emotional vacuum. When certainty disappears, the nervous system doesn't relax. It searches, it scans for meaning, it revisits the past, it tries to regain footing. This is why obsession grows quietly, not as desire at first, but as disturbance. Something is off. Something doesn't add up. Something that was guaranteed no longer is, and that question doesn't go away on its own. They might distract themselves, stay busy, post more, appear unaffected, but underneath, the pressure continues to accumulate because the mind hasn't resolved the missing piece. That's when attention shifts inward. Instead of monitoring your reactions, they start monitoring themselves. Instead of assuming access, they start questioning it. Instead of feeling in control, they start feeling exposed. And this shift doesn't happen because you did something dramatic. It happens because you did nothing. Silence, held consistently, removes the emotional safety net. It forces awareness. It forces reckoning. And here's the quiet truth behind it all. They weren't comforted by connection. They were comforted by predictability. Your presence made them certain. Your reactions made them secure. Your availability made them feel in control. Once that certainty is gone, the psychological ground beneath them starts to soften, not collapse all at once, not in a visible breakdown, but in small cracks that widen with time. That's how obsession forms, not as passion, but as loss of control. And once certainty is gone, nothing replaces it easily, which leads directly into the next phase. The moment they reach out, not from confidence, but from the need to restore what they no longer have. Because when certainty was their comfort, your absence becomes the pressure they can't ignore. 7. When they reach out, the game is already over. The message isn't the win, your posture is. This is the moment where most men lose everything they've quietly rebuilt. The text arrives, and it feels like proof. Proof that the silence worked. Proof that you still matter. Proof that you weren't forgotten. And in that instant, emotion rushes in before reason has a chance to catch up. Most men collapse at this stage. They see the text and rush back emotionally. They reply too fast. They soften their words. They lean forward, eager to re-establish connection. Not because they are weak, but because relief feels powerful. Relief feels like safety, and safety makes you forget why you went silent in the first place. This is where the conflict becomes real. One emotional reply restores the old hierarchy. The moment you rush to reassure, the balance shifts back. The uncertainty you created disappears. The pressure that was building dissolves, and all your silence loses meaning. What looked like progress collapses into familiarity. Men often believe that the goal was to make the other person reach out. But that was never the real shift. Reaching out is easy. Anyone can do it when they feel discomfort. The true test comes after the message appears. Because power doesn't belong to the person who speaks first. It belongs to the person who doesn't rush to resolve tension. This is where Stoicism reveals its edge. The Stoic responds only from calm, or not at all. That doesn't mean ignoring out of spite. It doesn't mean playing games or pretending not to care. It means refusing to be pulled back into emotional urgency. It means choosing composure over reaction. Authority isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain. Authority is unhurried. It's the pause before the reply, the neutral tone, the absence of emotional overflow. When you respond this way, something subtle but decisive happens. The other person senses that the old levers no longer work. The rhythm they relied on feels different. They no longer know where they stand. And that uncertainty shifts the dynamic further in your favor. This is why so many men sabotage themselves at this stage. They mistake contact for control. They believe that engagement equals progress, but engagement without restraint restores the very imbalance they wanted to escape. The Stoic doesn't chase resolution. He allows clarity to surface on its own. If the other person reached out because they felt the loss of control, rushing to soothe them only gives that control back. But when you hold your posture, when you don't rush to fill the space, the pressure stays where it belongs. On them. You are no longer reacting to be kept. You are no longer proving your value. You are no longer negotiating your worth. And that's when the game is already over, because the outcome no longer depends on their message. It depends on who you are now, calm, grounded, unmoved. This is the real shift. Not the moment they reached out, but the moment you realized you don't need to rush back to remain centered. From here on, every interaction passes through a new filter. Your time has weight, your attention has cost, and your presence is no longer automatic. Authority doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives with stillness. Now comes the real shift. 8. You were never meant to be chosen. You were meant to choose yourself. The real power move was never obsession, it was detachment. For a long time you believed the goal was to be picked, to finally receive clear attention, consistent effort, and undeniable confirmation that you mattered. You waited for the signal that would settle your doubts and quiet the noise in your head, and without realizing it, you tied your worth to their reaction. Every reply became a measurement. Every delay felt like a verdict. Every small gesture carried the weight of your self-esteem. That's the trap. When your value depends on how someone else responds, you surrender control before anything even begins. You don't need them to reject you to feel small. You do that work yourself by chasing outcomes you can't command. This is where Stoicism cuts the cord. Not through anger, not through bitterness, but through clarity. Stoicism doesn't ask you to stop caring. It asks you to stop needing. Because the moment you stop needing outcomes, control returns. Not to them, but to you. This is the conflict most men struggle with. They fear that detachment means loss, that if they loosen their grip, everything disappears. But what actually disappears is the anxiety, the overthinking, the constant negotiation with yourself to stay acceptable. When you stop needing outcomes, something profound shifts. You no longer shape your behavior to provoke reassurance. You no longer explain yourself to secure position. You no longer rush to close gaps just to feel safe again, and they feel it. Even if they never admit it, even if they don't understand it consciously. They feel the absence of pressure. They sense the change in rhythm. They notice that your energy no longer bends toward their mood. This isn't manipulation, it's gravity. When you're no longer chasing a result, your presence becomes heavier, more grounded, less available for casual consumption. And people respond differently to that, even the ones who once offered you crumbs. This is where you reclaim what was always yours. You reclaim rhythm. You decide when to engage and when to step back. You stop reacting on cue. You reclaim boundaries, not walls, but edges. Clear limits that define where you end and others begin. You reclaim self-command. Your emotions stop running ahead of your decisions. Your reactions slow. Your posture changes. And that's when crumbs lose all power. Because crumbs only work on someone who's hungry for validation. When you're no longer starving for approval, the smallest gestures no longer impress you. Vague interest no longer hooks you. Inconsistency no longer excites you. You stop mistaking attention for intention. This is the quiet victory most men never reach, not because it's complicated, but because it requires letting go of a fantasy. The fantasy that being chosen would finally make you whole. The truth is harder and more freeing at the same time. You were never meant to be chosen. You were meant to choose yourself. To decide what kind of access people earn. To recognize when effort is mutual and when it's exploitative. To walk away from situations that only function when you keep shrinking. This isn't revenge, it's alignment. And alignment changes everything. Your standards rise without announcement. Your energy becomes selective. Your life stops orbiting around someone else's availability. From that place, you don't need obsession to feel powerful. You don't need anyone to collapse emotionally for you to feel validated. You don't need proof that your silence mattered. Because you already know who you are when you're not reacting. And that's the position no one can take from you. So sit with this honestly. Not as a challenge to them, but as a reckoning with yourself. If they only valued you once you stopped giving, were they ever worthy of access to you at all? If this message resonated, it's because you've lived it. You've waited for replies that came too late. You've accepted effort that never quite matched yours. You've felt how crumbs can keep a man hopeful while quietly hollowing him out. But now you see it clearly. It wasn't love that held you there. It was conditioning, uncertainty, and the habit of giving more than was ever returned. Stoicism doesn't teach bitterness. It teaches clarity. It reminds you that your energy is finite, that your attention has weight, and that peace begins the moment you stop negotiating your worth in someone else's emotional economy. You don't need revenge. You don't need obsession. You don't even need closure. What you need is self-command. When you stop reacting, the dynamic changes. When you stop chasing, the pattern breaks. And when you choose yourself, crumbs lose all power. That's not coldness. That's strength. If you're ready to live from principle instead of impulse, make sure you're subscribed to Stoic Station. This channel exists for men who are done being pulled by uncertainty and ready to stand grounded, calm, and unshakable. And before you go, answer this honestly in the comments. At what moment did you realize you were surviving on crumbs? And what did it cost you? Your answer might help someone else wake up too.